My name is Christopher Martin. I'm on the executive committee of the Urban Design Group, and I'm also director of urban strategy at Urban Movement. Tonight, we're going to be focusing on Glasgow and telling the regeneration story of the city from a myriad of different angles and perspectives. And to chat this through, we've got a really exciting panel lined up to introduce and discuss some ideas. And I'm really grateful for them joining tonight on this, what is in London at least, an absolute sport-driven evening. First up will be Niall Murphy of Glasgow City Heritage Trust. He's going to sort of bring to life some of the history of the Dear Green Place. And then Graham Ross of Austin Smith Lord will take on two themes, talking about how the city has and continues to change and regenerate, as well as talking about the city's ambitions to repopulate the city centre. Peter Mccaughey of Wave Particle will then talk about making connections, working with others and co-designing. And Judith Sykes of Useful Projects will talk about creating a productive city. And finally, I'm going to discuss and introduce some ideas of Glasgow's transport story, looking back, but importantly forward. We'll be talking for about an hour, I think, in this one, and then we'll look forward to lively discussion, debate, and conversation for about 30 minutes following that. So thank you again for all tuning in. I'm sure you know this has been a series the Urban Design Group has been undertaking, all about our towns and cities and how we need to shape them going forward. And please do check the events page of the Urban Design Group for more information on future ideasSPACE episodes and how to get involved. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over first now to Niall to kick off. And just a reminder to please put all questions and thoughts in the chat. Niall, please take it away.
Thank you, Chris. I'll just share my screen and get this started. Okay, right. The evolution of Glasgow. A wee primer on the evolution of Glasgow for everyone, just in case people don't know Glasgow at all. So essentially what I'm trying to do in 10 minutes is compress over 1,000 years of history as quickly as I can. So in essence, Glasgow was established in the 6th century, and this is Roy's military map of Glasgow. So this was done just after the Jacobite Rebellion. So it gives you an idea of what the scale of the city was at. So it was a very small settlement still at that point. You're probably talking 20 to 30,000 people living in the city at that point. And the way that Glasgow originally worked, it's a dumbbell on plan. So you've got a node around the cathedral, which sits towards the top of the screen. So you've got a node there, and then you've got another node down the bottom, which is Glasgow Cross and the Tron. And that was where it was easiest for the fishermen to get access to the Clyde to fish. And so the high street developed as a spine between the two of them and took 500 years to develop. So, and we'll continue on from how the city developed thereafter. And unlike, say, with Edinburgh, where you had the Norloch between the old town and the new town, because of the geography of Glasgow, Glasgow could extend away from that medieval spine of the city. But what's interesting when you look at plans like this, and what's interesting about this is because you realize that at this point, and this is after obviously the union of England and Scotland, and on the back of that you get serious growth happening in Glasgow, because suddenly it's got the merchants in Glasgow have access to the eastern seaboard of America and the early colonies there, and they have like a 6-week competitive advantage over their rivals in London. And so what they end up doing is they secured the tobacco trade. They get the monopoly for the tobacco trade in Europe for places like France, for instance, because they turn the city into an entry point for that. And what is particularly fascinating about this is because of how they operated, their economic system and how they operated meant that the apprentices for the tobacco lords had to actually base themselves in the early colonies in America. And so they knew the whole eastern seaboard, they knew the Caribbean as well. So they were aware of all the early developments in kind of urban design at that time. And they actually re-imported those developments back into Scotland. And so where you get Glasgow's grid, and Glasgow is obviously very unusual in the United Kingdom in having a grid, so it makes it kind of the least British of the British cities, that's actually a re-import back from the United States. So, and you can see how the grid is appearing here. So that's James Barry's plan for the second new town in Glasgow. And that basically, Glaswegians have always tried to reinvent their city. So there are various kind of big urban interventions. We'll come across that as we go through this. And this was a major one, extending the city away from the medieval spine of the city. And you get a square in the center of it, which is modeled on the squares in London. So that's George Square. with the aim being to have a square that was like the West End squares in London and also like the squares in Edinburgh as well. So, and this is at the start of the kind of explosive growth. So this is the era of Adam Smith, the economist who was based at Glasgow University and wrote the majority of, and did research for the majority of his wealth of nations, in Glasgow, because he was actually, talking to the tobacco lords. So he understood how their economic system worked. So that leads to massive explosive growth throughout the 19th century. So the city really begins to take off. It overtakes Edinburgh as the largest city in Scotland, and just keeps on going thereafter. So this is as a fantastic view of the city taken from a balloon over the south side. This is by Thomas Sulman, who did these illustrations for the Illustrated London News. So this is what the city was like in 1864. So enormous growth by this point. But the consequence of this explosive city growth is you get issues that begin to emerge. Poverty in particular, urban health, major issues in Glasgow, and it's something that is still very much with us. And this is all manifested, and this was something that came about. The Glasgow City Improvement Trust, a major innovation that Glasgow did. The first time that any city in the United Kingdom had sent a delegation around Europe to study what the Europeans were up to in terms of reforming their cities. So they did a tour. This was led by John Carrick, the city architect in Glasgow. They did a tour around Europe, took the Lord Provost, Blackie, with them, and Dr. William Gardner, who was the first medical officer for the city. So he was in charge of the city's health. They did a tour. Their last stop was Paris, and they were blown away by what Baron Haussmann was doing in Paris. And so they brought those ideas back to Glasgow. But one of the innovations that they did as part of the Glasgow City Improvement Trust was they got the photographer, Thomas Annan, to sit and record what the old city was like, so all the wines of the old city, and to show how bad the overcrowding was. And this had been something that had been with the city for decades. So, for instance, you have this fantastic quote here from Frederick Engels, Conditions of the Working Class in England. So this is from a parliamentary debate in 1838, which tells you exactly what the city was like at the time, about the amount of filth and dirt, and the smell must have been appalling when you think that Thomas Allen would have had to go into these unventilated, poor sanitized conditions in order to take those photographs, and the time it would have taken him to take those photographs as well. It must have been quite a task. So these kind of the Ordnance Survey maps of the city at the time are particularly fascinating because they show the impact the City Improvement Trust had on the city. And it was hugely influential. So you got parliamentarians, Octavia Hill, for instance, she brought parliamentarians up from London to see what Glasgow was up to see what the English cities could do to kind of improve their lot based on what Glasgow was up to. So that's the city in 1855, and the heart of the city over what is Glasgow Cross. So it gives you an idea of how dense and kind of organic the growth of the city was at that time. Zoom forward to 1892, the whole city is gradually getting simplified out as the City Improvement Trust is building new roads, reorganizing whole sections of the city. You've got this whole area here, which is completely under review. They had hoped the developers would buy these kind of brownfield sites. Didn't happen like that. They ended up having to develop them themselves. And that's the city by 1910. So huge growth still, but it's much more regulated, much more thought through. And John Carrick was a real visionary in those kind of terms and a modernist. And so that is why you end up with what is roughly kind of the second city of the empire. So this is 1905, Thomas Annan again, taking a panorama from, this is Glasgow University moved wholesale to the west end of the city because cholera had jumped the walls into the old university complex. And that was considered unacceptable, and so they ended up moving. They got a really good deal from the railway operators, and they ended up moving out to the west end of the city instead. So that shows the view across Kelvingrove Park, which was set out by Joseph Paxton, and it shows you Park Circus, which is one of the glories of Victorian urban planning in the UK. So, and this gives you an idea of just how dense the city was by the interwar period. So it was the UK's other million-plus city. So by 1925, its population had peaked about 1.1 million. Obviously, there's not a census in the Second World War, but it probably got slightly larger than that. But it was a hugely dense city. So the it's the most densely populated city in the north of Europe. So operating at twice the density of London. Now, that was considered a major deal. So that was something that was considered a real problem, and it was something that had to be addressed because the urban conditions in Glasgow were extremely poor. Part of the reason for that is that we have tenements in Glasgow. The tenements range right across all the kind of social classes. But because of how tenements operated, they were for rent. And during the First World War, when rent controls were put in place after a rent strike in Glasgow, which was for a worthwhile cause because the landlords were upping the rents at the time, that destroyed what's called the factoring profession in Glasgow, which was to look after and maintain the tenements. So after the First World War, the tenements did not get properly maintained at all. It was just abandoned. And by the time you're in the post-war period after the Second World War, you're talking about 3-4 decades of no maintenance at all. The buildings are beginning to fall apart. It's a serious issue because of the overcrowding at the same time. So something had to be done. And what the Glaswegians did, everybody was instructed, all of the major cities in the UK were instructed to come up with a plan for their city after the Second World War. Glasgow's was the shortest. It ran to about 27 sides of A4. And this was the Bruce plan. And basically the Bruce plan was to demolish the entire city centre of the city, start again with a ring road around it. And there were rival plans too. You've also got Sir Patrick Abercrombie's Clyde Regional Plan, which was for taking the density of Glasgow and spreading it out in a series of overspill new towns around the city as well. So you've got these two rival plans competing with each other. And there was also tax incentives. It was a scheme called Skimming the Cream off Glasgow, where tax incentives were offered to the brightest and best to move to those new towns. So it was leaving a core within the city of poorer people, less able people who were stuck in the city, which obviously caused health issues. So, and there was this whole vision of turning Glasgow into the kind of LA of the future, even though Glasgow had the lowest number of cars per head of population of any European city at this point. This was their vision. They went to the south of France to see what Corbusier was up to in the Unité de Habitation. And they also sent delegations to Los Angeles and to Pittsburgh to study what the freeways were there. And they managed to get a team from LA as well, who would map out what the highways were to look like around Glasgow. So this was this whole new kind of vision of the future, great leap forward. And combined with that, there was a series of comprehensive development areas created around the city as well. So effectively, 40% of the Victorian city was demolished to make way for a new city. So it had an enormous impact on the city, a real dislocation of the city, whole areas just completely wiped out. So on the back of that as well, you get a whole kind of Jane Jacobs scenario going on as well, where you've got cataclysmic, what she calls cataclysmic money, where there's an awful lot of money spent on a problem at once. But at the same time, you've also got what you would refer to as redlining happening, where whole areas, because they're created comprehensive development areas, no investment goes into them. So the whole fabric is beginning to fall apart. All that was documented by this photographer, Nick Hedges, for Shelter in the early 1970s. You can see just how appalling the urban conditions were at that point. And the poverty was by far the worst in the UK by this point. So, and what's interesting as well, you see modernity sweeping over the city, and how the grids, this is a view of the Gorbals and Hutchison Town and the Gorbals, and how the grids of tenements, which were really well laid out and well built, but didn't have the facilities, no inside toilets, things like that, were swept away, and modernity in these new housing estates, so that's Basil Spencer's Queen Elizabeth Square, you can see in the foreground there, are gradually being imposed on what was formerly a grid. But it didn't work. The scheme comprehensively failed, in particular with Basil Spencer's project. That became an election issue in the 1980s. And even though an enormous amount of money was spent trying to retrofit the building to get it to work, it was referred to as the dampies. There was so much dirt and damp. And the housing conditions in there, they were impossible to live with. It was one huge cold bridge. And so it ended up being demolished in 1993. So that was seen as the kind of the failure of the whole comprehensive development area program. And the city had to reinvent itself. But at the same time, what you get is people who were trapped in the tenements, who realized that they were going to be stuck there for many decades still because the kind of renewal program was going to take so long to reach them. They decided to do something about their conditions. So you get the first instance of this is what was called Annie's Loo, which the Lord Provost at the time actually came to open up Annie's Loo. And Annie Gibbon, who was with Raymond Young, was the instigator of this. And this was how they reorganized the flats inside the tenements, because they realized that these flats that did not have any kind of toilet within them, you could do that if you just reconfigured them slightly. So Annie Gibbons referred to it as the best 190 quid she ever spent, because she finally had an inside toilet. And that made people think, well, hold on a minute, we could actually rehabilitate the tenements rather than bulldoze them. And that gave rise to Scotland's local housing association movement, which is still going strong today. So that was a major initiative. And Scotland's housing association movement has actually become the kind of, they're at the forefront of design now. They're commissioning some of the best new social housing in not just Scotland, but the UK as well. So this is New Gorbals Housing Association, Cran Street in the Gorbals, a tenement by Elder and Cannon, which is attached onto the side of their offices by Page and Park Architects. And it gives you an idea of what they're capable of and how contemporary the design is. These are really good flats. So, but nevertheless, the legacy of the CDA has left the city with kind of brownfield sites, dereliction, poor health outcomes. By the 1980s and the 1980 recession, things were so bad, the city's population had, from a peak of 1.1, fell, it was intended to fall to about 750,000. In fact, fell to about 570,000, so way overshot. And you've got kind of, you know, it's risen back up again to about 625,000 at the moment. So, but effectively, you've got half the population of what should have been in the city have kind of disappeared. So we're all rattling around in a city that's, you know, capable of accommodating a lot more, and densities have plummeted as well. So this, you know, there's lots we have to do about that, and that's something in particular Glasgow City Heritage Trust are trying to focus on. So we are focused on things like vacancy in the city centre, how to get kind of buildings at risk back into use, how to get the population back up in the city centre. We don't have an awful lot of money to, you know, to deal that with. We have a budget of about £1 million a year, but, you know, we try and use that to leverage in and to help developers, you know, get people back into the city, and also to improve the condition of the buildings within the city. So just to wind the whole thing up, if people are interested in how Glasgow developed and how it's continuing to develop, these are the kind of key books, the key texts that you should read on it. So The Tobacco Lords by Sir Tom Devine, the great Scottish historian at the moment. Tenement as a Way of Life, which tells you all about how the tenement actually operated. Peter Reid's book on Glasgow, The Falling of the City, which is absolutely superb. And then finally, The Upas Tree, which is all about the kind of the industry in Glasgow and how industry effectively poisoned the city. And that's still a major issue nowadays, and is one of the things behind the Glasgow effect, particularly for the contamination of the land. So it's a major issue in Glasgow. So that's me.
Thanks, Neil. Absolutely fascinating run through of how we got to where we were is probably a fair thing rather than where we are. But I just like to get Graham up next and keep the conversation to afterwards. Graham, if you wouldn't mind sort of taking on some of those themes and talking especially about repopulation and regeneration, that would be great.
Thank you. To borrow Patrick Eddis's trio of past, present and possible, Neil's helpfully given a resume of Glasgow's past, and hopefully we can in the next while start to then unpack Glasgow's present and talk about Glasgow's possible future. So my name is Graham Ross from Austin Smith Lord, and I'm a member of a team that's been working with Chris and with other colleagues on this call, Judith and Peter, whom you'll hear from in a minute, and working with Ian Elder at Glasgow City Council, who's also with us this evening, looking at Glasgow City Centre in particular. So you'll recognise some of the themes and issues that Neil set up and how the city is trying to grapple with them. And as Neil talked about the competitive advantage of being at the northwest periphery of Europe, Glasgow has a long and proud tradition as a great European city. It clearly shares many of the challenges that other cities face, but trying to come up with a distinctive and locally distinctive approach to how we grapple with those global issues is crucial. And of course, whilst many will conceive of Scotland as being largely rural, and of course it is, it's a highly urbanised country with the vast majority of people living in the towns and the villages and cities of Scotland. And as Niall's just outlined, of course, Glasgow is Scotland's largest city and its only metropolitan centre. So the reach of Glasgow and the importance of Glasgow and its city centre is crucial, not only to the city, but also to the city region and indeed to the nation. More than half of Scotland's 5.3 million population can get to Glasgow city centre within an hour or thereby, and so its economic, environmental, social and cultural health and performance is crucial for the nation as a whole. In looking at Glasgow city centre, as with every city, there's of course a context with respect to city ambition and declared plans and policy context within which to work. And I want to specifically talk this evening about the city centre and the district regeneration frameworks that have emerged from the Glasgow city centre strategy. I would also recommend that you look at the Connectivity Commission that Glasgow undertook in the last few years, and I don't doubt that Chris will talk some more about the recommendations that the Connectivity Commission has brought forward. So in the city centre strategy, it defines 9 city centre districts that overlap with one another, but crucially also overlap and straddle the river and the motorway, the M8, that runs through the city centre. And these are the planning units that we've inherited as part of our consultant team that have been asked to take forward regeneration frameworks for 8 of the 9 that are on the screen. And so myself and colleagues at Austin Smith Lord and MVRDV of Rotterdam, along with a number of others, including Peter, who's also on the call this evening, undertook the preparation of regeneration frameworks for these 4 districts. And Peter, Chris, Judith and I are part of a team that's just been commissioned to look at the next and final 4 in the piece. And I'll say something about all of these districts in the next wee while. Glasgow City Council quite rightly required us and demanded that we took an evidence-based approach, and so we've been working with Space Syntax and others to assess and analyse the data that's available and undertake that analysis, but of course enrich that through creative conversation and through engagement with as broad an array of Glaswegians as we possibly could, those that live, work, study and invest in the city, but also those that come from further afield and have a stake and a passion for what goes on within the city centre itself. And so, of course, borrowing the People Make Glasgow slogan that the city goes by and that you saw in Niall's opening slide, we've adapted that, I suppose, as the kind of the motif of the project. It's not our city centre. This is very much a collective effort, and we're very eager to engage in conversations with groups such as the Urban Design Group, but indeed, others who have some guidance and some advice to give from your own perspectives, but also to through authentic participatory planning, engage with citizens to shape their future and work with, not with communities to develop and establish that collective vision. And so it's not only about big strategic moves, it's very much about a bottom-up community-led approach, be that business, resident, civic, cultural community, but also facing into some of the big strategic challenges and in the inheritance and legacy that Niall outlined from some of those planning moves in the mid-20th century. So trying to build up a tempo of small-scale, quick wins, as well as some of those longer-term, transformational, long-term projects. Of course, as I said at the outset, whilst taking a local approach, it's about also facing into the shared and global challenges that we all face. And of course, Glasgow is due to be hosting the COP26 UN Climate Change Conference this year. It's now scheduled for November 21. But using that and using some other aspects of contemporary society and the challenges that we're facing into, to act as a catalyst to start to have a conversation about what next for Glasgow and what next for these communities. And remembering, of course, as Niall outlined, that intelligent investment in infrastructure, of course, the merchants of Glasgow that Niall referred to, that Glasgow had in the 18th century invested in opening up the river, and of course that then opened up Glasgow to grow in the way that Niall outlined. And if we can capture some of that boldness, but perhaps temper it with some of the hubris that perhaps the 20th century planning story tells us, to of course, get the essence of that gallousness, that self-confidence that Glaswegians proclaim, and infuse that with the creativity of local people and that creative economy that we enjoy in the city, but do that in a way which is tempered with a sense and respect for people, of place, and of the planet. Of course, when we look at these 9 districts, we've got to recognise that these are, artificial planning boundaries, and of course, the granular sense of character and distinctiveness at a neighbourhood and street level is very rich. And so, getting the grips with and understanding that that rich built heritage and the story that Niall has outlined, overlaid with the social heritage, is crucial. And of course, starting to also understand and map out some of the inequalities and issues that the city faces. Of course, in the invitation to this evening's session, there's reference to the Glasgow effect and that issue of understanding why population health generally in the city doesn't compare well with other equivalent cities, but also trying to understand how to bridge the gap between the health inequalities, the issues of social justice and economic and environmental justice within the city. And we want to absolutely face into that in the projects through the regeneration frameworks, aligned with the broader endeavour that's outlined in those strategic documents that the city has already published and I referred to earlier on. So of course it's about understanding that patchwork of issues, the socio-economic performance, the cultural assets, the access to jobs, the access and connection to opportunity, and indeed those areas where there is, for instance, transport poverty. And Chris in particular and our team has been mapping and looking at where those blind spots are within the city's urban mobility network and ways in which we can make sure that we can reconnect communities to the destinations, and everybody therefore has cause and access to get to the city centre itself. Of course, those 9 districts, when you look at them as jigsaw pieces, have very different spatial characteristics. And when you start to analyse in terms of how we occupy space and the amount of vacant and derelict land, or underused or inappropriately used open space, there is clearly scope for transformation, and there's clearly scope to backfill and adjust the way in which the city is occupied, attending to some of those legacy issues that Niall outlined in his opening remarks. And of course, when you also then start to look at land use and activity within the city, there are clearly pockets where there is compact and mixed use, but there are other neighbourhoods and other districts where there is a monoculture, and that zonal planning has left us with some aspects of the city that very much warrant being enriched with that greater mix of use. So the debate over the last few years in the course of the first regeneration frameworks that were undertaken through from 2015 to last year, and the next round of regeneration frameworks is of course about what goes where and why, and who and how will we deliver this. So starting to map that, the possibilities, the priorities in the city, starting to understand the array of potential projects, large and small, and not be overwhelmed by the sheer scale of creativity and idea generation that's come through this process, but start to develop those priorities strategically, clearly, and aligned with measures of success, be they in terms of the repopulation of the city, be they in terms of the adjustment of how we use open space and reduce car dependency, or be they about how we make sure that we align the political will at a local, regional and national level so that we can secure and deliver change in the medium and longer term. So of course it's about setting those objectives, of course it's about that participatory planning approach, but it's also about finding ways in which we can break down silos, enable the culture of collaboration, and apply the notion that the Scottish Government have launched through their place principle of ensuring that that collaborative effort ensures delivery and quality of delivery for all at a local level. We have the benefit of a city centre strategy board, we have the benefit of city deal funding, but trying to ensure that we can monitor change, monitor the performance of the city, and monitor how the implementation of these recommendations, how they impact the city going forward, is something that we need to get sharper about so that we can have very much a more informed and agile approach to how we approach city planning. So of course, as Chris has alluded to, it's about therefore achieving that mixed use. It's about re-densifying Glasgow. So as Niall outlined, There was a point in time where Glasgow was one of the densest cities in Northern Europe. Well, it's rapidly slid down the scale, as you can see. So seeking ways in which we can, utilise the opportunity and the space we have in the city, repopulate and appropriate vacant and underused space within our existing and rich built heritage, as Niall's outlined with the monies that the Heritage Trust and others have, and seek ways in which we can try and find the right level of urban density within the city centre, coupled with an appropriate social and community infrastructure that ensures that the schools, the health and social care infrastructure is there to enable all age groups and all facets of society to find a place and cause to live in Glasgow city centre is going to be absolutely crucial. Of course, how we optimise the available space in Glasgow is vital as well, and whilst we've perhaps given a sense that there is a surplus of open space, and indeed there is in many aspects, how we use the amount of open space in comparison to, for instance, the ratios that other cities have is another thing that's been informing our analyses. So when you look at Glasgow in terms of, in comparison with an equivalent city centre areas, other UK cities, Glasgow has a disproportionately high amount of space given over to the motor car. So can we get that balance right? And of course, you'll be well versed, many on this call have seen these slides in the past in terms of winning back space for active travel, for pedestrians, for walking, wheeling and cycling, such that we can perhaps use the great urban grid of Glasgow, not in a glib way in terms of applying a tartan approach, but applying an intelligent and smart approach to how we use and perhaps adapt the likes of the superblock model so that we utilise and benefit from a more appropriate and a hierarchical approach to using that urban grid. And then use the space that we've got within the great Georgian street pattern that Niall's outlined to greater effect and transform some of these routes to be far more about connecting communities by active travel means rather than simply providing space for every single conceivable mode of transport on every conceivable street. Of course, in recent times post-COVID, we've been, we've supercharged the notion of prototyping and trying before we buy, and we've been encouraging the city leadership for a number of years now, as has Chris, in terms of ways in which to test and trial in advance of actually implementing some of these measures. Glasgow also suffers from the issue of a disaggregated and disconnected public transport system in terms of the networks, in terms of how they're operated. And time and again, we faced into the issue of how to organise the various modes of transport in the city centre. And Chris will say some more, no doubt, in terms of that agenda in his presentation. But suffice to say that despite the beaching cuts, Glasgow still retains 6 mainline railway stations within a very compact city centre. 2 of the 3 largest stations in Scotland are within the city centre. And so maximising and optimising the benefit, investing in the public transport inheritance we have from the Victorians in a way which ensures that we achieve that modal shift, maintain that quality of public transport network, notwithstanding the challenges that the post-COVID era provide us. And then look at the urban edges. And of course, Niall outlined the challenge of the motorway coming through the city, but also that disregard for the river. Glasgow made the Clyde and the Clyde made Glasgow, but it's somewhat fallen out of love with its river over the last period of time in trying to create not only a place to gather, but attend to what was in the previous slide, the lack of quality open space within the city centre, such that the river becomes that great urban gathering space within Glasgow city centre is a long-held ambition, but one which we are starting to see, following this work, a sense of momentum towards achieving that. And getting a sense of using both banks of the river. You cannot walk on both banks of the river for the full length of what you can see on the slide at this point in time. Let's make sure that we join those assets, such as the hydro and the SEC and the Riverside Museum, back to the city centre so that we have a continuous blue-green infrastructure that joins up the city. Let's reintroduce the city to its river so you don't have to cross 6 lanes of traffic, as this family are doing, to get down by the water's edge. And then we get to a point where we rediscover the fact that Glasgow city centre benefits from that north bank location, south-facing aspect over the river, and ensure that we can enliven the river banks, but also the river itself. And of course, one way might be to start to utilise the river as a mode of transport and a means of pleasure. rather than simply as a place to get past and a barrier in the city itself. And Chris, I'm not sure I'm doing for time, but I'll perhaps just close with some remarks about the M8 and then just a little flavour of the project that we're about to embark on, or we've just started to embark on, which is the motorway itself. Of course, as Niall mentioned, there's the relics of parts of the Bruce plan, and we have the legacy of that, as you can see here in the Anderson Cross area. And looking at ways in which we can repair the severance created by the motorway on the north and the western side of the city centre is fundamental. We have new motorway infrastructure in the city region that, to our mind, presents an opportunity to avoid driving motorway traffic through the city centre, and perhaps it allows us to then start to untangle the motorway spaghetti that we have and start to prune some of those on and off ramps, win back space, and utilise the infrastructure that we have for the meantime to start to heal and to repair and reconnect the communities that have been severed by the motorway infrastructure in innovative ways, and perhaps not be able to rapidly get back to the node that was Anderson Cross and is now this, but perhaps start to find ways in which we can repair and rejoin the city together so that communities can access the city centre, enjoy and benefit the city centre, and the future then provides a set of priorities that are about enhancing quality of life. And so Chris and Peter and Judith and myself are on a team that's led by Studio for New Realities and Austin Smith Lord and Urban Movement, and we're looking at the next 4 regeneration frameworks. And I would use this evening as a call for ideas and a call for guidance in terms of how we tackle the legacy issues that Niall outlined in the Merchant City that some of you may be familiar with in the southeastern edge of the city. The Learning Quarter that goes all the way from George Square in the west to the Necropolis in the east, and the cathedral you can see there with the green roof. Townhead, nestling just next to the motorway, and Junction 15 in the northeastern corner of the city. And Cowcaddens, which spans the northern edge of the city and goes up to the canal and across to the inner west end. So it's about healing, it's about addressing the legacies that Niall's mentioned. It's about trying to conceive of how we refresh and reimagine the comprehensive development areas of Cowcaddens and Townhead, and start to ensure that we infuse that with an agenda that's about quality of life, about creating a healthy, dynamic and thriving city, and one which is working at all of the scales, both as a great international and European city, as a city that drives the Scottish economy and culture, but also one which is a great place to live in the everyday for those that live, work, study and invest in the city. And always remembering, as Niall's outlined, that Glasgow starts here. So I'll just skip a few slides to close on the fact that at this point in time, we're just building a baseline and starting to develop an evidence base, and we're about to embark on developing proposals with communities. We're clearly, we would have dearly loved to have been in a scenario where we could have done as we did before, engage on street, in situ, with those that are in their neighbourhoods and in their districts. And we hope to do that in time when it's safe to do so. But in the meantime, we've established a range of online tools and ways in which you can contact the team, as well as a free phone line. And we can hopefully circulate these details to you all after the event. And we would urge you to engage with us. And hopefully we get to a point where, through creative collaboration and co-design, we can develop a future for this young girl and for all the rest of the future generations of Glasgow that seeks to learn from the lessons and from the past that Niall's outlined, good and bad, and seeks to create a city that enjoys a great quality of life in a fantastic location. Thank you.
Thanks, Graham. That's a fantastic flavour of the huge amount of work that Glasgow is undertaking at the moment to reimagine the city. And I really look forward to and welcome the audience's thoughts on how we can improve the city centre going forward. Peter, can I now just invite you to talk about making connections in a different way?
There you go. Can you hear me now? All right? Yeah. I
can hear you, but your slides aren't shared. I think maybe
try that.
Yep. I can sort of see the workings still, and yeah, bang on. Nice one.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, Graham, and thanks, Niall. Very comprehensive kind of introductions to things we're working on. My name's Peter Mccaughey. I'm an artist, an educator, and a collaborator on teams like this. I run a small arts organization called Wave Particle, and we're very kind of public realm facing. We're kind of artist urbanists, and we're very interested in this territory. I think particularly in a city like Glasgow, which dares to have the adage, people make Glasgow, this idea of making connections is critical. This is a drawing from the American artist Mark Lombardi, who made these beautiful but also functional maps of human relationships. And I hold it close as an inspiration when I think about an idea that people might make Glasgow or might make anywhere. In the work that I do as an educator, I often begin with students with a map of the city centre with a circle drawn around it and divided up into pies. And I get the students to walk the circle, which in a gridded city is counterintuitive and takes you through brick walls and public and private space, chimneys and police stations, and is a very interesting type of research into what you find in the live and present city. This is another tool that we use where, what do you think you know about a city? Well, why don't you test that by throwing a dart at a map and just going to that place and beginning your research live there? And what it always does and never fails to present is that, our ideas of history, and Niall has filled our minds with the great depth of the history to Glasgow's sort of planning structure, is always that history is always complemented by the present and the process of becoming, the changes that you find. So it never ceases to stimulate me that nobody can actually tell you what's happening in Glasgow right now, nor in any other city in the world, that there'll always be something unpredictable. Something will be on fire, something will be closed, something will be opened, someone will be there that we didn't know. So there's a kind of event nature to the city. And one of my great heroes, John Latham, Barbara Stervini, as a team for Artist Placement Group, said that we really should think of everything in its event nature, primarily in its event nature. And I think it's a very interesting way to charge our thoughts about planning processes, regeneration processes, and particularly in a city like Glasgow, which is so good at event-based activity, to think about the event nature of the city. And I love this propositional idea of the city, this relation between thinking about it and intervening in it and changing it. And this work by Dave Shrigley, which suggests that we might ignore the evolving SECC, and this kind of pathetic little kind of drawing on a placard, which somehow ends up having more power than the building itself. And that idea of play. Recently in some of our consultation processes, we were charged to imagine the city as it should be for infants and children, how it might welcome them, encourage them to be curious, make them feel safe to move through. And I think there's probably no better template that we could use than to say that's how our city should be designed and should work. And we should extend that to ourselves. We should never, ever, feel ashamed of acting like an idiot or being attached to a 2-meter lug that's really there to test the endurance and strength of the building by the belt of your trousers. So this is a work by Dan Graham, which I hold dear. It's a kind of articulation of a moment of conceptual art, which is really important, where he's sitting looking at a blank piece of paper and his typewriter in his flat in Manhattan, and he's kind of thinking about, the distance between things from interiority to exteriority. And we're all somewhere every day and every moment along this line of being inside ourselves to way at the edge of our perceptions and consciousness. This is a map I made with my father, which is the place where he grew up in the boglands of Tyrone in the Bar. And it's a kind of personalized vernacular map of the place where he learned to fall off his bicycle, of the quirky nicknames for neighbours, of the wee bits of kind of history that you'll never find on a topographic map, but things that are still knowledge and still important. And that's a thing that I think is incredibly important as we seek to make connections and remake connections to the way that we've become alienated in the modern city, and in a city like Glasgow, which, as Graham pointed out, has this kind of huge motorway driven right through the heart of it, which is, what the Situationists, critiqued in terms of the dominance that we have given over the last 100 years to the motor car. And this way that we become alienated from ourselves, from each other, from the place where we live. And it's so important in an ambition to make connections and remake connections to think about how we remap territory. So when we begin a process in a small place, in a big place, at a local level, national level, I often begin with trying to kind of just map, not list, but map the relationships of any place and any kind of given set of relationships. This is my son, aged maybe 8, making a map of his friends and people important in his life with breadcrumbs in a restaurant in some kind of somewhere in Italy. And, the people that are closest to the center of the circle are the most important, and those people at the edges are still important, but maybe less so. And it's an interesting game to play. It's a changing game in our own lives with our relatives and our best friends and the people you've seen and strangers that you've met to make these maps of connections. We use all sorts of tools in these processes, and the tools are all predicated on the need for not doing things the way we've done them before, the need to be inventive and creative. Graham evoked the spirit of Patrick Geddes, who's a great hero of mine as well as his, and probably Niall's as well. And the Future Walk is one of the tools we use where we try and connect the past to the present, to the future. So we look at images like the one Niall's was celebrating in the locations where those images were made, as we're traveling through the present to plan for the future. So our thoughts about the future are charged by the reality of the present and the reality of the past. It's a very simple tool. I've told you about it, so it's yours. We're a very copyleft organization, and I think it's alongside other tools that we use that sort of are all centered on how do we make connections. The hand-drawn, the homemade are very important to us, and we often make maps of these kind of connections. We record anecdotal testimony. It's so important. And I think if you believe that people make Glasgow, then you believe that the collection of those anecdotes, as we did with the Village Storytelling Centre, and the mapping of those in relation to where they occurred is really important. And I'm at pains to emphasize on the team, although I'm the artist and one creative influence on everybody else's creativity in the team, is that I'm at pains to emphasize that anecdote can turn into, an observation of safety, health and well-being, where there is surface drainage needed, where we might add lighting. These things can be mined for other functional knowledge that really shapes some of the other pragmatics within the team. And so forth and so on. So we work a lot with these kind of maps. Niall, you'll be pleased to see this is a map that we're actually going to bring to the surface of High Street, which is this great line that runs through Glasgow, the medieval line, which has been sadly abandoned in recent times. So we're redressing it with some of the history that it has carried and literalizing the process that we did sometime previously, where we worked with the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, the surface of the street, the people who work on it, the people who pass through it, and we encouraged people to make their own flags, and then we went in a flag procession at the street. And this was a tool to kind of connect to the history of the street. So a kind of meeting of history and people's own personal aspiration for the place. Again, we do this again and again. This is a kind of return to, we made a film about the street and presented it on the street. And that literally is the baker, Petar, who is Lithuanian, who's chose to come here and set up his business. I think somebody who chooses to come to a city is incredibly important, that they would choose this place of all places, and we should listen closely to why they came here and how we are treating them and how we can support them better. Particularly, to the challenge to businesses post-COVID and all the rest. Yeah, I really believe this city's adage that people make Glasgow. And if we take that and we take the event nature of the city and we take this idea of just do it, it's very interesting to say, okay, let's change Glasgow in the next 24 hours. And we can do so, even in the challenges of kind of social distancing that we're presented with. We took a lot of ideas from Glasgow to Venice, where we were fortunate enough to represent Venice in the Architectural Biennale, and to be celebrated for doing so for the same kind of principles that are enshrined in this idea that people are everything within this process, and making connections is everything within this process. And we ran the Biennale successfully on a tiny budget and a very, very successful recipe where we just trusted people, and we turned over the space, this brilliant palazzo, to the Venetians and to the passers-by to make it their own. And it was the simplest formula you could ever do. We believed it. Everybody else began to believe it. The people themselves began to believe it. And it was a little revolution in Venice, which still lingers on. I'm nearly out of time, but I just want to come to a couple of other things and to complement Commonplace, which we're using, which is a great digital resource, not perfect by any means, but a very useful tool for gathering commentary online. We proposed to our client and have been permissioned to build a sister to Commonplace, which is a hand-drawn version of Commonplace, which will end up looking like this. This is a lovely drawn illustrated map of the ZAD in the south of France, which will be a map of testimony, of anecdote, of history, and of ideas that will kind of look like this. These 4 districts will be mapped, hand-drawn, full of interview, commentary, podcasts, personal anecdotes, testimony, and it will look like this sister work, which will be fueled by the hand and by the voice of the people who live there. And this is the kind of current interview that we're proposing. And this is the drawing that has licensed that interview with William Lee and his boss in Chinatown in Cowcaddens. And it's really interesting how the drawing made the interview possible, because they saw that we were celebrating something that was important to them. And the history of Chinatown in that part of Cowcaddens is rich and complex and changing. And the challenges that they face as a Chinese community post-COVID, at a time when it's very hard to recruit a Chinese waiter because they all want to be moving into the kind of computer industries or the other industries, is very telling. So I'm going to leave it there and stop screen share, if I can do that.
Thanks, Peter. Absolutely excellent. I love the idea of artist urbanists and the sort of mapping anecdotes. It's a really beautiful thing. I'm just going to pass over now to Judith Sykes of Useful Projects to talk about some ideas of a productive city.
Thanks, Chris. Sharing now?
Yeah.
Great. Okay. Well, thanks. What Useful Projects have been asked to do is really set the level of ambition for the DRFs in relation to sustainable urbanism. And just to put that into context, I think what we've seen over the last couple of years is with the climate strikes and real action around the climate and biodiversity emergency, that sustainability is really back on the agenda. And we have this really great opportunity where all the professions are signed up to, their engineers declare, architects declare, the councils have also declared some 1,300 jurisdictions worldwide, but that includes Glasgow and their commitment to 2030. So it's a real opportunity to harness that commitment and that alignment through the DRFs. And as Graham has already mentioned, although it's been postponed till next year, it will be important that the city showcases what it can do around the climate agenda, but also benefit from hosting the Conference of the Parties when it happens next year. We also, many of us have been reflecting on what the global pandemic and lockdown in particular has brought out. There's been a stark focus on the inequalities that exist, but what it has also demonstrated is what a different, cleaner and greener future can be. And many, including Nicola Sturgeon, are calling for economic packages to be used to build back better. And what's great about Glasgow is that it does have this policy framework which promotes all of those, the elements of what we're doing around a fairer and a greener society. So we're starting from a good place. But what we've been really inspired by as a team is this Kate Raworth's donut economics, which really captures well this notion of providing a fairer, greener society. So providing a minimum social foundation within the context of an environmental ceiling. And we've interpreted that for the DRF around 6 key things around social foundation and climate, nature and circular to define that environmental ceiling. So what we've done is translate that into 6 key sort of goals, if you like, that the DRFs need to deliver, so that climate, in relation to climate, that Glasgow and through the frameworks becomes a carbon neutral city. It's mitigating carbon emissions, mitigating climate change, but also responding through adaptation and building community resilience. That it really does use resources very wisely. So it's a zero waste economy, really building on the principles of the circular economy. And nature, extremely important in the context of the biodiversity component of the nature or environmental emergency. So you'll hear us all talking about how we can bring back nature and bring back green space through the DRFs into the city, and through that repair that Graham talked about. And each of those things have really strong connections to the social value that we create. So making sure that places are much better connected, that permeable and porous, that they deliver community value, empowering citizens, meaningful employment, but also the social infrastructure that others have talked about, and all of that contributing to sort of more active more and healthier lifestyles. So we have also been looking at precedent case studies, really, and what you'll hear about is how those have been applied into the different quarters within the DRF frameworks that we're looking at. And to inform it, what we have been looking at in particular with the design team, with the team, is how case studies, precedent case studies, can be used to sort of be very clear about what that ambition is. And so Chris asked me to talk about the productive city, and I'm going to do that through the lens of the circular economy. Focus on retrofit. With so much of the building stock already in existence, we do need to look at opportunities around repurposing buildings, not only to avoid waste and make sure that we maximise the value of those materials, but also to ensure that the path to zero carbon is not just about getting to zero carbon, but the pathway there is concave. And the best way for a concave path is to improve the performance of existing building stock. And so a couple of examples here, right from Glasgow, the retrofit of Cedar Court to passive house standards, and this bottom image showing how retrofit can be applied to commercial buildings to repurpose them into different types of commercial uses. So that's 55 Baker Street in London. So remanufacture as well. There's a big opportunity to repurpose those existing buildings, but encouraging businesses that are aligned with remanufacturing. So organisations like the Fab Lab movement that are quite well known now have taken over existing buildings for businesses that are focused on transforming the way in which materials are sourced and used. So that's the top image. The bottom image is the Blue City in Rotterdam. It's a repurposed swimming pool that has been filled now with incubator companies looking to exchange residual materials. And that concept of thinking about how we use stuff in the city also feeds into the sharing economy, and this has real community benefit. If we can do things like this example of the Library of Things, where we own you know, if we're living in smaller places and we don't need so much stuff, can we rent it? Can we share it? And in doing so, that makes these products and services much more available to everybody as well. So it's very inclusive, as well as not owning so much stuff, which then doesn't get used and ends up in landfill. So then we need to think about the way in which we build, and so the concept of buildings as material banks as well. So how do we enable that through the framework, or provide the policy incentives through the framework? So the top image is of Park 2020 in Amsterdam. It's a cradle-to-cradle working environment where the buildings have been designed for disassembly, and parts of them can be even composted at end of life. And of course, buildings have a long life, and so this whole concept of buildings materials banks is enabled by the digital technology. So things like blockchain material ledgers as a way of tracking materials throughout their life cycle. And lastly, there's a concept of community mobility hubs that are increasingly seen as a way of accessing different sharing transport modes or different mobility modes as we shift away from the car. But what we're seeing with increase is also an opportunity for those hubs to become convenience hubs for local communities. And this is really also responding to how logistics in the city is changing, how we're using different modes of getting goods around the city. So we have, you know, organisations like UPS, but also Sainsbury's trialling sort of cargo bikes, the robots that have been trialled in Milton Keynes. But there's an opportunity to really rethink these hubs as much more fully encompassing the circular economy and recycling and reverse logistics as a way of enabling the circular economy and you know, the movement of goods and services throughout the city. And so I guess what productive city is on more with less, and that is the circular economy. We need to do more with less, but also ensure that that is a business opportunity for creating social good and meaningful purpose. Thank you.
Thanks, Judith. That's absolutely brilliant. Some really interesting strategies. I look forward to discussing more in the conversation later. I'll just share my screen now and talk a little bit about the sort of transport story for Glasgow, and just before we get into some conversation. Okay. So yeah, without as you might guess from this image, for a long time the most popular mode of transport in Glasgow was the car, and it's still used by 2/3 of people for journeys around the city today. But it wasn't always this way, as other speakers have alluded to. Like many European cities, Glasgow's history is one of public transport with an extensive network of trams and a city of walking, with a connected and legible street network stretching from city centre to the residential areas in the west, east, north and south. So it's interesting to reflect on what changed, and I think it can be framed in the context that, like many cities globally, Glasgow allowed transport to serve itself for many years. And it's safe to say, again, it wasn't solely a Glasgow issue. And as we saw in Niall's presentation earlier, it was predicated a lot in America and in other states like that. But, when we let transport serve itself, essentially we'll fill any gap we give it. And this way of thinking, which we've seen across the globe, had a direct effect on the city's ability to deal with urban crises such as climate change, growth, inactive lifestyles, and social exclusion. And it's important to remember that transport wields an enormous amount of power in a city, affecting people's lives, society itself, and very much the image of a city. And the most important opportunity we have when looking at urban regeneration projects is that we need to harness transport's power to achieve our ambitions and create the places that people want. And following the path that Glasgow went, we've seen this before, and this sort of introduces some of the great work in the Connectivity Commission. Glasgow went from a public transport and walking city to a city with where 25% of the land in the city centre was given over to vehicles, which is especially interesting when we see the comparisons here of 18% in Manchester, 14% in Newcastle, and 12% in Edinburgh. And this is what Glasgow's somewhat no-holds-barred approach looked like to get there. And the effect on the street network, the walking environment, and public transport viability was clearly profound. The M8 motorway was built through the city centre, and as you can see in the area on the right, and this was constructed between 1968 and 1972. And this regeneration project came to Glasgow via the Bruce report, which Niall mentioned earlier, which was published as the Second World War closed, and described the Glasgow Inner Ring Road as a motorway box to encircle the city centre, which sounds quite ominous. But it did just do just that. It cut communities off from one another. It put a great deal of more cars on the streets. It changed the image of the city, and it changed the way people moved about, and it interacted with the city, and of course destroyed quite a few fabulous buildings as well. In this instance, transport was serving itself. But not just that, it undoubtedly created the conditions that the city has been diligently standing up to in more recent years. The Glasgow effect highlighted the dramatically lower life expectancies that Glaswegians had compared with any other part of Scotland. It led to a dramatic increase in the number of cars in the city centre, obviously correlating to the large proportion of people choosing to travel by car. And it impacted air quality for one, with a lot of the city centre still being over legal limits. So that was how we got to where we were. And there's been a lot of good work to date to make the city centre more livable again. And our work in the latest round of regeneration strategies, as Graham outlined, has started by asking really what kind of places we want, and then finding the transport solution that delivers that. Essentially, we have space in between buildings, and we've been asking others and challenging ourselves as to what we should use it for and how hard we need to work it so it serves people, society, and the environment to make the city more equitable, affordable, and sustainable, rather than just serving a commodity. And I can probably boil that sentiment down to a simple message. So it's taking space from a one-dimensional movement typology and incorporating space for business, space for active travel, space for life, as well as space for public transport, bus, rail, and metro, and space for increased climate resilience, sustainable urban drainage, habitat, biodiversity, and tree planting, and importantly, space for urban childhood, space for fun, relaxation, and community. So essentially, we move from this to something more sophisticated, which gives us a far greater return on investment from the space we have. So to give you a brief flavour of the transport analysis and thinking we've been getting up to, we have a clear focus on delivering social justice as part of this work. And this will continue to be at the heart of our policy and thinking. Transport has a huge part to play in delivering social justice for Glasgow, as well as everywhere else. And a key reflection is that car ownership in central Glasgow, as well as the sort of the northern, the northeastern, and eastern Glasgow sections we're looking at, is incredibly low. And yet the transport environment is completely dominated by vehicle infrastructure. And that's sort of starkly present in some of the images we've seen tonight. And as a result, access to opportunity in Glasgow is defined essentially by owning a car. Yet cars are expensive and not everyone can afford one or wants one. So essentially democratically and inclusively connecting everyone in society to opportunity has to be the key driver, and that's certainly one we're exploring. And in investigating this, we've undertaken a huge sort of exercise in mapping. We've mapped how long it takes people to reach key services from home via public transport, with the worst performing areas glowing deepest red on this plan. And over that, we've then mapped numerous indices of deprivation and ill health to create this kind of plot like this, highlighting where transport poverty is most prevalent. This is then where we've been targeting our sort of propositions, our what ifs, and testing these ideas with people. And this essentially is building on the fantastic work the Connectivity Commission started, and which Graham mentioned, expanding on the proposed new metro system for the city. And what we're showing here is the yellow dots are indicating where derelict and vacant land is. We're then sort of mapping in the lighter blue the proposed Connectivity Commission metro lines, and you see these are tackling some of the areas with the greatest transport poverty. We're also proposing or putting the proposition out there of introducing these darker blue lines, which pick up these areas in a bit more detail and form spurs of this new metro, as well as proposing a sort of a second loop of the metros. The metro at the moment serves the West End and the sort of southwest of the city, and we're proposing to make that into a wing formation and actually start to pick off some of the areas of vacant and derelict land, regenerate these areas, or sort of start to spark interest in redeveloping on these vacant areas of land, and also trying to fight this transport poverty we see here. And we've looked to take this further as well, sort of connecting strategies to deliver on this social justice, but also deliver on health agendas and climate agendas too. Here we're testing the idea of creating climate-safe corridors, linking people to opportunity in a way that is really cheap, healthy for them and healthy for the environment. And these key streets here shown in yellow, picking up these areas of most deprivation, could be streets that prioritize clean public transport and truly and genuinely invite people to cycle through high-class infrastructure. So essentially looking to create this type of infrastructure through community centres, and in between these urban centres, out to rural communities, how can we provide attractive cycling infrastructure alongside clean public transport, so alongside these new metro links? Because essentially at the heart of this is the fact that the city centre, to the extent of a city region, is between a 13 and 30-minute cycle. So city centre to wilderness, for want of a better phrase, in 30 minutes, in a way that's healthy, just, and environmentally friendly, but also really cheap and a lot of fun. So if we get the infrastructure right, we can unlock access to opportunity, to leisure, and to increase health and well-being. We've also been looking at the important role that buses play in the city and developing strategies for how we can increase the attractiveness of public transport going forward, but also shape public transport in a way that benefits everyone in the city. And as part of that, we've been asking the sort of question if a central bus station is in the right part of a city for the city going forward, if it needs to offer more for the city, and how can we sort of sweat the space it occupies harder. It would be remiss of us not to ask some serious questions about the M8 SCAR. What role does the M8 play in the future, and how can we stitch communities back together and connect across the motorway is, of course, a topic of intense investigation. And the city is already working on the ground to resolve this as a result of the regeneration strategies in the other parts of the city and the Avenues project. This project called the Underline is looking at streetscape interventions to connect people through the sometimes uninviting spaces created by the motorway, such as here, where the M8 is severing residential areas behind me to the city centre and the new Glasgow School of Art building just behind that billboard in the distance. And so this project is soon to be on the ground, and essentially it's pushing walking and cycling infrastructure through in a direct, convenient and inviting way to make walking and biking a pleasure again. We're also looking at larger scale projects to bridge the gap as a result of work on the previous regeneration strategies for the city. This project in particular was looking at how to connect over the trench of the motorway, because at this point it's sunken, and connecting back nationally important institutions such as the Mitchell Library there, you see on the left with the dome, back to the city in a way that provides this new public space, so providing a cat park over the motorway. And of course, everyone's favourite topic is parking, and we've been starting to look at strategies for how Glasgow should shape city centre parking, learning from precedents like Oslo, and what the work they're doing there on parking, but also how can parking sort of deliver maximum benefit for the city, its businesses and residents and residents alike. And in line with Glasgow's ambitions to repopulate the city centre, as Graham was discussing earlier, we've been looking at how we can make the city centre a better place for urban childhoods. Transport, of course, has a huge role to play in this, both connecting children and indeed, well, everyone, to things and the places they need easily, healthily and safely, but also creating great environments for children and adults to let their hair down, enjoy the streets they live on. And this, in fact, is the first of the avenues to be delivered by the city along the famous Sucky Hull Street. And this is what it used to look like. And I suppose in a way to sum up, Glasgow is looking fresh at the space it has in the city and asking serious questions about what they want from that space. Is it right to give over so much space to storing and moving vehicles? Has to be one of the questions Glasgow and indeed cities everywhere needs to have an open discussion about. And that's part of our process here. And we have been and continue to ask that question because the space can yield a far greater return on investment if we give some space over to businesses, to trees, to planting, to habitat, to sustainable urban drainage systems, as well as to making walking and cycling the easiest choice. As well as providing space, of course, in the city that everyone, regardless of age or background, feels comfortable to learn to ride a bike on, to sit in and relax, to have some fun, and to live life on. And I'll leave it there just to touch on some of those issues, and hopefully we can pick up some of these in the chat. So I'll stop sharing here. Can I just invite the panel to unmute, and I'll pick some questions out of the chat which we've spoken, which have come through, and start the conversation that way. And I would say if anyone has any questions from the floor, if they'd like to make me aware, then I can pick you up. I think there's been plenty of action in the chat. I think one question is an interesting one to start off. Is someone's asked that there's been a progressive erosion of plot diversity in the city due to large institutions buying up and amalgamating plots. they're asking for the solution, which is good. But I suppose, how do we encourage a reversal of this trend and look to sort of stitch some of the large institutions of a city back into the city, and sort of, rather than having them facing inwards? So we're talking, sometimes the universities can be accused of being quite inward looking and quite insular, but how do we start to stitch those back into the city? I know, Graham, you've looked at that as part of the work in the regeneration frameworks this time, and also touched on it last time. I wonder if you could sort of update as to the roles that you see the institutions having in the future, and how we can go about stitching them back into the city fabric.
Yeah, happy to do so, Chris, and colleagues can add if they feel necessary. And in some respects, in terms of that question, it's a pity our colleague Jeroen Zutgeest from Studio for New Realities isn't on the call, because in terms of that plot-based urbanism approach, I know that he and colleagues, when he was at MVRDV and in his current practice, have been looking at quite radical models in terms of trying to take a plot-based self-build and more granular approach to a new urban reality, rather than simply using the conventional and the tried and tested and well-established model. And I know that they, from a continental European perspective, find, shall we say, some curiosities in terms of the way in which we've structured our legal and fiscal way of doing things in the UK. So I think we are very interested to explore, for instance, in the Cowcaddens and Townhead area, where there is an increasing level of vacancy in terms of underused buildings, and the prospect of trying to, whether it's through site assembly or different ways of trying to address issues of land ownership, but then try and organise and or encourage new and fresh ways of doing things, so that we perhaps can test and pilot a different approach, and take a cue from some of the radical and enduring lessons that, for instance, Niall mentioned the housing association model, and how it emerged in the city organically in response to significant challenges that were being faced in the post-war era. And similarly, in terms of the cooperative movement, I think it's also been mentioned in some of the chat lines that I've had a chance to glimpse at. So in terms of that bottom-up plot-based approach, we're interested to perhaps find ways where in the north and the eastern fringe of the city centre, where there's perhaps less pressure currently in terms of the property market, there is perhaps an opportunity for us to restructure the way in which we do things. In terms of that same space, to answer the question that you were posing, Chris, we have on the face of it, whilst as Niall's presentation demonstrated, there's been a kind of westward migration of the city from its cathedral and high street westward as the city grew and prospered, and there's almost been a kind of neglect and willful neglect in some respects to the north and the east. The area still has an embarrassment of assets. It's got 2 universities. It has the cathedral. It has the second largest hospital in the city. It has world-leading arts and performing arts institutions in the Glasgow School of Art and the Royal Conservatoire, as the City of Glasgow College. So there are significant institutions, some of which are quite well embedded and integrated into the urban fabric, others which over time have become almost isolated islands within the urban setting. And so ways in which we can unpack that and reintegrate those campuses into the city, so that they become a seamless extension of the city, rather than being isolated and creating barriers within the city environment, is something that we're especially eager to explore. And we've had some very promising and encouraging conversations with the higher and further education institutions so far. We look forward to having similar with the NHS with respect to the hospital, and seeing ways in which we can make these anchor points within the city work and create a positive environment around them, so that they're better connected and deal with some of the severance issues that several of us have spoken about this evening.
Thanks, Graham. I don't know if anybody else wants to come in on that point. Peter.
I think if I could chip in very quickly, just to
Neil?
say that
Yeah.
what's been interesting in terms of regeneration, and the parts of the city that regenerated fastest have been like corridors like Finiston, which is hugely popular now. It was shuttered a lot when I was a student in Glasgow. But you know, it's the fine grain of the urbanism there, the Victorian and kind of late Georgian tenements, and how they allowed these small shops to go in underneath them. So you've got mixed use there, and because those spaces are cheap, it has allowed people to go in there and experiment and create a really interesting area that really appeals to people. It's incredibly walkable. It's those areas that benefited, and it's the natural kind of urbanism of that, an organic kind of regeneration of them, which has been most interesting. When you look at what the Brumilo and places like that have been, it's been large footprint offices. And I think there's a policy issue that you have to look at there about how you handle the ground floor of those offices, because too many of them have been given over and ultimately have wound up in office use as well, which is just, it's the lack of permeability through those frontages is definitely an issue.
Peter, please.
I totally agree, but I also think the question invites some really, really palpable and tangible answers, and I think there are some really palpable and tangible answers. I think that it's really worth remembering, and Niall's presentation did remind us of that, that cities have tended in the past to emerge over centuries. And what we now have is a situation where the kind of scale of changes are happening in tiny periods of time, super accelerated periods of time. And we know in places, you know, like China, the rumors of cities emerging within years. And in this insanely accelerated development pace, it's very hard to be smart enough. So I want to pay tribute to my colleague Graham here for putting his money where his mouth is and actually assembling very wide teams like ourselves on this project that give some kind of chance of representation of a broad spectrum of experts across many, many fields. And I think multi-headed teams are essential, that we remind each other in those processes of the importance of these sort of, you know, complex models as kind of Niall has evinced, you know, organic processes which are super intelligent and we still don't fully understand, sort of emerge through many, many iterations. And I think, so the challenge is to be smart enough. And I think in the short term, when we simply aren't smart enough, what we should have is an absolute ban at planning level on a type of monoculturalism, as we have seen in student housing and in an area like the IFS, you know, the ISD, the International Financial District in Glasgow, which frankly I think has to be seen as, you know, not a great idea. And when you walk through that after 6 o'clock at night, it's a ghost town. I spoke to somebody the other day who'd worked there for 3 years. She said it was appalling. And the kind of, you know, why does a city like Glasgow think that it should do that when it's full of musicians and flaneurs and artists and kind of makers and kind of, so the cross-pollination should be absolutely written into a tendering process, whereby, you know, you've got to show that your teams have got social workers and anthropologists and poets and all the rest, and that they will therefore attend to those social justice issues, to the complexity of cultural mix, and that we never again get descend to that kind of monocultural thinking. It isn't Glasgow, and I don't know anywhere that actually it does work. So, you know, let's just stop doing that.
Thanks, Peter. It's an interesting connection to another question which has been asked in the chat about Glasgow PLC and what business is Glasgow PLC in, and it sort of it ties to what you were thinking, what you were talking about there. And of course, it was formerly very much a sort of heavy industry, as Niall outlined earlier, in shipbuilding and railways. And the question is sort of how going forward is Glasgow going to tell its story, is going to generate inward income rather than sort of relying on investment from outside.
So do you want to direct that to somebody, Chris, or shall I have a go?
Graham, you start us off.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's recent reports prepared by Benny Higgins with respect to the kind of recovery post-COVID at a Scottish level. And in amongst that, it talks about playing to strengths. And we've had in the last number of weeks the privilege of having some conversations with some businesses, some activists, some community groups that are active within the districts that we are talking about. And it's evident, as we knew already, that there is an immense wealth of ingenuity and creativity within the districts in the city centre that we're looking at. And indeed, speaking with Janice Kirkpatrick, the acclaimed designer who's based in the Merchant City and who's active on the economic leadership panel of the city, the creative economy, which has a long provenance in Glasgow and is thriving in many respects, whilst it's fragile and in a fragile state because of the current economic climate, the ability that the creative and the innovators within this part of the city can have to ensure that kind of productive, creative, innovative economy is not just a case of jargon or buzzwords, but is actually based on what is already there. So ensuring that we can reappropriate some of the underused space, ensure that we can have easy in, easy out terms for to create a ladder of opportunity and a ladder of accommodation for new businesses in the creative economy, and around that sphere, we think is going to be one of the themes is going to be absolutely crucial. Of course, that faces into some of the issues we were talking about in terms of mixed use and making sure you seed that mix of use by the creative reappropriation of underused buildings. So yes, that does mean finding ways in which we can open up and access some of the hitherto undervalued built heritage that's within our midst. Yes, it means perhaps taking a hands-off approach to some aspects of regulation, or at least trying it to see how you can enliven and enable that to occur. And it absolutely does involve a greater awareness and a greater value placed on the talent and the creativity that's already within the city to ensure that can thrive and it can foster and encourage others to sustain that going forward. I think the other thing to bear in mind, as I mentioned earlier on, is that we have 2 universities and a city, Glasgow College, within these districts. And Scotland's first innovation district is within the area we're talking about. And again, when you look at the prospect of some of the work that's going on around Strathclyde University and Glasgow Cali, some of the work that's going on with respect to 5G, quantum, industrial informatics, space, health tech and fintech, really fascinating, and ensuring that we can create a cluster as there already is, but enabling that to thrive in and around this part of the city, I think is very tantalizing. Not forgetting all the time that we've got to make sure there's a clear correlation between and benefit, not only for those industries and those universities, but for the communities immediately within the midst of all of the activity that I'm talking about. And that's going to be very difficult to grapple with, but we're very eager to get guidance and advice about how best to achieve that.
Thanks very much. Judith, I wonder if you had any reflection on on the sort of the heritage of sort of heavy industry in Glasgow, and if there are any good examples from sort of international examples, or how we can get sort of modern industry back into Glasgow in the sort of makerspace format.
I think it really follows on from what others have said, and it's also in the context of what our national position is as well, and the wider sort of global what's happened with the global pandemic, but also our relationship with Europe is changing, and so on and so forth. And so what that provides us actually is a platform for bringing manufacturing into back into the city centres. So you have this heritage of manufacturing. It's gone, but there's this opportunity to come back, but much more focused on green technology and some of the sort of creative industries and remanufacturing that I was talking about. And I think I just wanted to pick up one of the comments as well, as is this a middle class view of what the future looks like, and how do we make sure that it is inclusive? I think it's a really good challenge, But you know, a lot of the initiatives that we're talking about actually, and I reference, are very bottom up. They're very community based, and so what the opportunity is there is to create you know, higher value opportunities and these ecosystems that relate universities to, you know, local makers, and building up that sort of ecosystem which provides a much broader opportunity for all. And I think also in the context that we've got a declining high street, we're going to have less of those lower value jobs around. We need to create much more creative opportunities. Sorry, that's a double use of the word creative, but you know, and it's inclusive. And I think with the work that Peter's doing as well, you know, we're having these conversations about what the future, and it's not just us saying it, it's other people, you know, are contributing to what your Glasgow should be, and having this dialogue about, you know, actually what a sustainable industry for Glasgow should be.
Thanks, Judith. We're a little bit over, but if you permit me a couple more questions in the conversation, that would be great. One of the questions has come in about do we need bus stations at all, and don't we need buses that are on the move? And I think it's certainly something to reflect on. I can talk about it for a little bit, and then if others want to jump in, that would be great. I think certainly I know that Graham, in the previous regeneration frameworks that you were looking at the idea of actually, so what are the sort of public transport mode of the future in terms of, will buses look the same? Will they be the same size? Can we not have a sort of smaller bus that moves around the city from key points? And there has been for many years the idea of Glasgow having sort of strategic locations of bus stations on the periphery of the city, which then bus stations sort of go to those stations on the periphery, and then sort of something takes them in. And I think the great thing about Glasgow is it sort of has that heritage of a really connected sort of network of streets, which really encourage and invite walking. And I think if we can get back to that situation where we can get people from the city region into the city in a direct way, and then create the conditions where they can walk or cycle into the city centre within 5 minutes. I think that's also a sort of a future we should be looking at, and how we can make those walking and cycling connections as well. Graham, do you want to reflect on any part of the work you did in the previous DRFs in terms of mobility and buses?
Oh, I mean, it suffice to say, and I know that yourself and John Dales and others have been having a lot of discussions about some of the curiosities about the bus routing in and around Glasgow city centre, and in essence, the results in dead mileage. The tracing the old tramline routes from arterial routes from the outskirts right across the city, of course, ends up with a lot of large vehicles with not many passengers as it passes through the city centre. So trying to find a way in which there's a more optimal, proportionate approach. Of course, as I see in the chat line, ensuring the welfare of staff is taken account of, but making sure also that we don't necessarily give over large parts of the city centre to layover space for coaches and buses that aren't actually being utilised to move people around the city. And indeed finding, and our colleague from Rotterdam is very passionate about the prospect of thinking beyond maybe the larger format bus to maybe smaller formats of means of getting people around the core city centre, which in itself is obviously quite walkable and compact. But for those that need to utilise public transport to get about, perhaps there's a more nimble, agile way to achieve that that's less space hungry in utilising that space that's finite within the city centre that we spoke about earlier.
Yeah, certainly from my perspective, it was sort of looking at the sort of the space that the bus station occupies, and I showed that sort of aerial picture, and it occupies a huge amount of a city centre, and potentially starts to see some of the, especially looking at some of the social indices of multiple deprivation plans that we've started to chart and map. You start to see that sort of the north and the northeastern parts of the city are scoring worse on some of those indices, and you start to think about what the sort of the contributing factors to that could be, and it all starts to sort of lean on that sort of large area in the bus station, and also the streets that feed it can then often act as large barriers. Does anyone else want to come in on that one, or should we move to maybe a final question so we don't keep everyone here for too long? And it's about it's about High Street and the work we've looked at in High Street. It was now I can't even find it. There we go. It was asking how we sort of reconcile the severance caused by the train cuttings all around the High Street area, and make them more permeable, and whether footbridges are enough, or have we explored any sort of bolder visions of a city, I should say, rather than us. Graham, I'm going to lean on you again on this one, just because I know you've been exploring this issue in detail in a separate sort of project for the City Council. And if you could maybe just put some meat on the bones around the High Street project that the city are undertaking there, that'd be very interesting.
I'll certainly do that, but I'll also tee up Peter, who I know has been looking at the High Street from a different perspective with respect to how the High Street can be redefined as a High Street and as a thriving thoroughfare, rather than the kind of eastern orbital of an inner ring road that never happened. So, I mean, I think the issue of the rail infrastructure, of course, High Street, for those of you that know Glasgow, the rail lines coming in from the east, underground, just at High Street as they move westward towards Queen Street Station and into the heart of the city. And some of those maps that you saw Neil present, where the old university, old college lands that were east of the High Street then gave over to goods yards and a massive railway siding. And of course, that's now vacant. It's been given over in part to car parking historically, and is slowly getting redeveloped with infill development. But of course, when you look at, and the space syntax analysis shows it very clearly, it creates a massive zone within the city between Duke Street to the north, Gallowgate to the south, High Street to the east, that is, very impermeable with respect to any routes north, south, east, or west. And so, as the question suggests, yes, there is a need to improve connections. There are footbridges identified as a first step, but depending on the kind of topography and geography of the area, there is undoubtedly scope to try and create a more seamless transition north to south there, albeit it would warrant some more significant engineering than creating footbridges. So we've already started to look at, even with those proposed routes and some potential new routes, what the wider network benefit of stitching that part of the city together is, and it's quite significant. And similarly, as I think I also saw in the chat line, starting to look at some of the repairing some of the desired lines and the lost connections north and northeast from Townhead and Cowcaddens, so that we can repair the severance of the motorway, and crucially we can reconnect the likes of Parliamentary Road, across into Royston Hill, and somehow or other grapple with the, as you describe it, Chris, the evil genius that is Junction 15 at the top of the town at Townhead, and grapple with how to repair each of these pieces. None of it is easy, but if we can make the case and demonstrate the benefit, then we can at least incrementally work towards trying to repair and reconnect the city on the north and eastern fringe. And crucially, we see what we're doing in these city centre districts as not only about trying to repair the city centre, but to have a halo effect, to have a wider benefit to the immediate hinterland, so that we can reconnect those communities that have been cut off by the infrastructure, and they can then benefit from better access and better proximity to the city centre itself, and vice versa, of course.
Thanks. And Peter, do you want to come in on the different sort of angle you've been coming at High Street?
Yeah, I think. Sorry, is that unmuted?
No, you're good.
I mean, there's a lot to say about High Street. We've been active on High Street as a small organisation for a couple of years. I think maybe last things first, and just to note that in my mind are some of the points that Paul Sweeney is putting out, which I think are really great to return to, and really maybe we could have a whole conference based on those, which are, and I've been thinking as we've gone along here, of the need for the same kind of need for a kind of expansive, creative, academic, kind of rigorous reflection on economic models as we have had on urban and architectural and models. and the need where, Paul's reminding us of kind of to think about how things are supported. And I think that's particularly relevant with High Street in mind, because I'm really concerned about what I'm going to find when I return to walking the boards on High Street. We interviewed pretty much every business on that street. We made a film with as many people who would speak to us, which was over 50% of the proprietors on that street. And we did it only about 9 months ago, and had an event celebrating the street on the street. It was one of the images I showed. And Chris, it felt really like a good moment. It felt like a lot of the kind of complaint culture that was active on that street had been bypassed, at least for a moment. And there were a lot of new businesses, a lot of old businesses, and there was a kind of coming together of those people in their precarious relationship. The nature of High Street, as Niall will testify, is that the buildings, the shop at ground floor level, are very unusual architecturally. They're long and deep, and kind of they're not really suited to being easily converted. So they're perfect for a kind of artisanal kind of small bakery or sort of, a particular sort of a business. But they really struggle with the rates level, as levied by city property. And they will particularly, I can't tell you how many have closed during COVID. I know that in March, 6 were gone. 6 of the, enterprise and businesses were gone. So I think that the economic level, that is that medieval line through the city. And the city has been doing something brilliant on that I think should be celebrated. Angus Miller, Councillor Miller, and everybody, they asked themselves a question. This is my impression. Everything that I say is my own opinion. But I believe they asked themselves the question 18 months to kind of 2.5 years ago to say, how do we fix the city? Why don't we start with one line? Why don't we start with High Street from the top to the bottom, and really we'll bring every department from the city council together, and we'll make it a kind of, we'll give it top priority, and we'll get everybody in the council talking to each other, which doesn't necessarily always happen. And we will try and fix this one line in the city. And by doing so, let's learn how to fix the city. And I think it was massively ambitious. And there were 22 live projects led by, I think it was Paolo Pacini who was coordinating that. And it was just a really fantastic endeavor. And I think if you imagine High Street with the kind of attention that some of the avenues have received, Chris, and working in that way, you could imagine how it could return to the type of permeability that, Niall was inviting. But the economic model is doubly challenging now post-COVID. And I don't know, what do we do? And I think we have to think about city property. City property is a challenge for the city and for themselves. How do you have a kind of bespoke treatment when you own so much property all across the city and have a relatively small number of staff? How do you keep a pleasing for prototyping, which allows you to try things like the meanwhile spaces on High Street without kind of necessarily being able to promise that economically all over the place? And and how do we allow permission ourselves to fail in something like the meanwhile spaces prototype, which was, if people don't know it, it was putting artists organizations into 5 spaces at kind of zeroed rent and rates, where people running businesses in the streets are paying, top or mid-range rates, and creating, tension in that way. But I think a really well-meaning endeavor at the same time. So there's a huge amount that we can say to complement Graham's overview on that, which is about, the granular detail of that. And I think, the brain power in kind of your organization and groupings like this need to be addressed to, come up with some creative models based on this. And we should dare to continue to prototype and test, but we have to take those points that Paul Sweeney's putting out about the economic models and say, those have to go hand in hand with everything, Graham, that you've been pushing to develop. We really need to say, who's paying for it? And, how do we localize the resource, and how do we dare to zero rates on the entire street to sort of say, this is what we need to do for the next 2 years to see if this street can come back to life post-COVID?
Absolutely. So it's fascinating. And I know we could talk about it all evening, but I think it probably takes us to the close of the event. And apologies for the overrun there. I think I'll sign off with 2 points. And the first one is really important. And please do get your thoughts and ideas through to us in the Your City Centre 2020 Commonplace. If you can find it by just searching that. So the ideas from the chat and some of the conversation we've been having here, we can certainly pick some of that up and sort of transplant it into the Commonplace. But if you can get that information to us by visiting that site and filling out some of the more detailed questions, it would be hugely valuable. So finally, I just want to thank our panel and thank you for tuning in. Thank you very much.